Hello, and welcome to episode 72 of the Wool Circle. The first thing you're going to notice is that I'm not Rachel. My name is Rebecca, and I am a new member of the Woolen Spinning team. As you probably know, Rachel used to produce the Wool Circle as one of several kinds of content that she's had to step back from recently for, that work-life balance that's so important. And she gave me the opportunity to come into this space and offer you something a little bit different. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and my experience and history with spinning, who I am and all that stuff. And then we're going to dive right into a demo. We're going to be talking about sampling. So let's go ahead and roll the intro credits and then we'll leap right in. So as I said, my name is Rebecca. You might recognize me from, I've been on one of the live stream episodes. You may have heard my voice on the Woolen Spinning Radio podcast a few times. I have been spinning since about 2009. I started spinning about the same time I got married and around the same time that I started my knitting blog, actually, which you can find at osbornefiber.com. That has become my home online for expressing myself on all kinds of creative stuff. And I got into spinning very slowly, and I took a spindling class, and then I ended up working in a yarn store that sold spinning wheels, and ended up just during shift one day, I was working with one of the spinning instructors and she taught me how to use one of the wheels. I got my first wheel for Christmas and the rest is kind of history. For many years, I was a knitter who spun. I couldn't quite figure out how spinning fit into my life. So I just spun sometimes and then went for long periods without. I had my kids, and after my second kid was born, something happened one day. I was reading Deb Menzies' book about spinning in color, and I realized I had some solid colors that I could play with, and I just fell into it head first. I was spinning every day. I'm Googling, how do I spin a sweater's worth of yarn? And that's how I found Rachel and Woolen Spinning. She had just launched Patreon at that time. This was in 2017, January, I believe. And this community has become very important to me. I live in a very isolated place, which I'll tell you more about in a minute. So having this community of spinners that from around the world that I could be connected to and bounce ideas off of has meant so much to me. So as I said, I live in kind of a unique place in the world. I live in the Canadian Arctic in Rankin Inlet, Nunavut. And I've prepared just a little clip to show you rather than just tell you about where I live. We're known in the Arctic for our winters, but we also have really beautiful summers. We live right on the Hudson Bay. This is just a stone's throw from my house. And I'll take my dogs to run out here. These are my two dogs. This is Cisco, who's a husky mutt. And we're also taking care of his mom, who's a tiny little who knows what, but who we love very much. Where is she? This is, again, his name is Cisco, and he's about a year old, and this is his mom, Diamond. These are my three kids. They are three girls, ages 9, 7, and 4. And this is pretty representative of their personalities. They're a lot of fun. They are ready to get into school this year, and they they know how much mama is into wool. We live in the Arctic because my husband and I are Anglican priests. We serve this community, which with our congregation of mostly Inuit. And we were invited up here, and we are just so thankful to spend our lives up here. And I do have one spinning friend up here in the Arctic, and I often go spin with her at her cabin, and that's where that shot was taken. So enough about me, except to say where you can find me. You'll see my email address is attached. That's osbornefiber@gmail.com if you ever want to just reach out and ask a question. And you can find me on Slack and on Ravelry as Rebby J. Again, if you want to find my blog, it's osbornefiber.com. So what are we going to be doing here in this space? The Wool Circle is an awesome podcast, and you have access to all those episodes where Rachel has been talking about all kinds of wool-focused topics. For me, as I step into this space, one thing that Rachel and I were noticing, that as she has grown as a spinner and is getting kind of up into the stratosphere of topics like cotton and luxury fibers and spinning on supported spindles and weaving, there are always going to be people joining this community who are wanting to go back to those foundational topics that were covered earlier in the history of woolen spinning, and who are maybe not ready to jump into those other topics. So I'm here to spend some time really digging into those foundational topics, things like spinning an intentional yarn, how to sample and get the yarn that you want, colored management and color blending, and any other topics that we decide are relevant. I want to stay focused on wool, and I want to stay focused on those things that we always come back to. So whether you are just getting into your spinning journey or wanting to dig deeper, or if you're an experienced spinner who wants to kind of dig back in and focus on your practice, that's what we're going to do in this space. We're going to do it in a module format. So we're going to work on one topic for, say, 2 to 4 months. So for the next 4 months, for September through December, we're going to be looking at sampling. We're going to dig deep into how we sample, when we sample, why we sample, what are the different pieces, what are we hoping to get out of it, how much do we sample, all those questions I want to dig into. So the way that I like to make videos is I really like to take one project from beginning to end in one demo. In the live stream, you get a great snapshot of all the things that Rachel is working on at once. I like to give you one project from beginning to end. That's just what I enjoy. So you're going to get that from me once a month on the first video of the month. And then we're going to, for the second podcast on the third week of the month, I'm going to be just conversing with you, answering any questions you have, or talking about some issues. So please drop your questions in the chat box or in Slack or anywhere, because I would love to talk about that stuff with you. So as we get into these topics, if you find that you want more direct coaching and support, you might want to consider joining our chat group, which we're calling Spinning Staples. That's an exclusive group that's at a higher tier level. You'll get access to these videos, but we're going to meet in a Zoom group twice a month in weeks alternate with this podcast, so that we can talk about those issues and talk about where you're at. And with the module format, if you find a topic that you really want to dig into, you can subscribe to those levels for just that period of time, and then drop out if we're going to cover a topic that you're less interested in. That is totally fine. And when you're in those levels, you'll have access to all those recordings. So without further ado, let me dig right into these questions of sampling. So for our demo this month, I'm going to just give you a super straightforward walk through my entire sampling process. I'm going to start with a basic top of fiber, just like what we typically use most of the time. And I'm going to show you every single step. I'm not normally going to do this, but just for once, I wanted us to step back and look at how many steps are we talking about? How long does this take? What all is involved? This is going to be review for many of you, but I hope it'll also be a chance to open a conversation about, well, what else do you do that I might not, or what do you sometimes do and sometimes not? So without further ado, let's go ahead and dig into our demo. The fiber I'm going to be looking at today is this beautiful top from West Coast Color. It's on her biffle base, which is 100% blue face Leicester. I love the way she puts it up because unlike a typical braid, it doesn't get compacted. And this has been sitting in my stash for over 2 years. I got to buy it down when I was visiting Rachel in Vancouver right at the beginning of COVID. So I'm very excited to finally dig into this. So I am going down this top and I'm opening it up a bit. If this were a more conventional braid, I would probably do this the day before I wanted to sample and hang it up in the bathroom, and while we took a couple of showers, really let the fibers relax and open out. I'm going down the whole braid and opening it up to find that sort of flat space where it wants to be. And then I'm using my hands to find about 1/8 of the fiber to start pulling it apart. I'm going to strip off 1/8 down the entire length of the braid. I may not use that entire length the whole time, but you know, if I really want to make a substantial sample with enough fiber, with enough yarn to both knit a swatch and be able to have a little skein left over, you know, 1/2 ounce is a really good amount. Less than that, and I'm not really going to get enough information. So I'm going down the whole thing. I'm going to strip that off, and then I weighed it on a scale to confirm that it's about the amount that I want. As you see, that's about 1/2 ounce. The first thing I do when I sit down to sample is I have my sample card and I get that ready. I take my index card, just snip along the edge of it a few times and write down just the name of the fiber and what draft I'm doing so that I don't have to stop and do that later, and so I don't have to try and remember it. Excuse me. Now, my mantra with sampling is that you sample when you need information. For this spin, I'm hoping to do a short backward draft, which I have not practiced in a really long time. I have been spinning sock yarn, fine sock yarn, and short continuous draft for like 6 months now, so my hands do not remember very well how to spin a thicker yarn or how to do the other drafts. I want my hands to really get used to something different. So I'm trying to get about a DK weight 2-ply yarn. So I go for a bit just to take a guess. I use my spinner's control card to take a look at my samples and then take a look at my plyback test to see, okay, that looks a little bit too thin. So then I'm going to try again. And I just keep going until I have the singles that look like they're about what I want. And I'm trying to really pay attention to what my fingers are feeling, how many fibers are going between my fingers, to kind of teach my fingers. It's so much entirely by feel and not scientific. I always try and let my singles go onto the wheel to get that last little bit of twist on before I pull it off and check it, especially for the sake of the plyback test. This is more, I'm seeing more what I like here. I'm taking a look at that plyback test. Okay. Now, since I have a plyback test that I liked, I'm going to try and get a good length of singles long enough that I can wrap it around the card because it takes kind of more than you think. I'm going to do one last test to make sure that I've got singles that I like, and then I'll be able to save them. I'm spinning on my Ashford Traditional, which is my workhorse wheel that I use for everything. I've got different flyers for it, so it can do whatever I want. Now I wrap that around the card. You can use tape on the back to secure it if you want to, of course. Usually I just wrap that around a few times so I get a good sampling of the variation in my spinning as well. Usually it's not absolutely 1000% consistent. So I can say, okay, as I check my singles, I'm checking them against a range of singles to see, am I going thicker? Am I going thinner? Which is very helpful, especially when you're not used to spinning a certain way. I'll break that single, hang on to it carefully, and take a playback test as well. Now I'll just gently untwist it a bit so that I can break it in such a way that I can reattach the singles later. And then what I usually do is tie a little knot. If you are the sort of person who can keep track of your hole puncher, then by all means, punch a hole in your card. I can never find mine. So I just snip a little zigzag in the top of my card and I can just wedge the playback test in there and the knot keeps it in place. It generally doesn't come out. You can use a piece of tape if you want to. So there I've got my sample card ready for me to actually spin the rest of my sample. The rest of my spinning is really an exercise in focus and trying to get my hands to spend a whole half an ounce doing what I've already established. I put that spinner's control card right in my field of vision or else I will forget about it. And I try and stop once every couple of minutes to hold my singles up to my card to see if I'm in the ballpark. That I'm going to go through that whole bump of fiber that exact way. I tend to check against the singles more than against the playback because the singles on the card really should give you a good comparison of what your singles look like at tension. And I'm always counting my treadles. So I find my playback is very consistent. I don't have to worry about that as much, but I do try and check the playback a couple of times in the course of the sample. And then I just wind it off into a center pull ball. Because I'm doing a 2-ply yarn, I'm gonna ply this sample from a center pull ball. I don't normally do center pull balls for any large amount of fiber, but for a sample this size, it's just about perfect. So you have to be comfortable enough managing a center pull ball in order to ply that way. We're going to talk another time about how sampling for a 3-ply is just a little bit more complicated. Now, when I'm plying, I am just as much sampling as I was when I am spinning the singles. I am looking for that sweet spot of bounce back for how much that plied yarn plies back on itself. That was actually a little bit not quite plied enough for me. I like my plied yarn to have a little bit more spring in it because so much twist comes out in the yarn. So I again wind it all the way on, and that's acting more like I want to see my plied yarn to act. I know that yarn, after it's soaked, is gonna still have a good amount of twist and be fairly balanced and sturdy. So then it's just a matter of applying the rest of that yarn, winding it onto a niddy noddy. I keep a small niddy noddy just for that purpose. It goes for a quick bath. I let it soak for about 15 minutes and then squeeze it out and hang it up overnight. I don't worry about putting in Eucalyptus for such a small sample. And I just put in lukewarm water and it's happy enough. And if you're planning on snapping or thwacking or any other kind of post-treatment of your yarn, you of course want to do the same thing to your sample. I ended up with this beautiful little sample skein. This is the point in the process where I want to take my measurements. So if you're looking to study wraps per inch, twist per inch, if you want information about your yarn, you want to get that information on the largest amount, on the largest sample possible. I'm not going to get deep into the weeds on what measurements I take. We might do that in a future episode, maybe next time if there's not a ton of questions I can get into that, but enough to say this is when I do it. And now, of course, we're going to knit a sample. We're going to knit a swatch. What I like to say is if your finished product is yarn, then your finished product is yarn, and that sample is enough. But if your finished product is a textile, then your sample is the fabric, and you need to know what kind of fabric you're making. So I knit that up on a variety of needles, several different sizes. That was the pre-washed swatch. Of course, it needs to go for a bath. You could see how rumply it was. Again, squeeze it out and pin it out gently to the size I want it to be. Not to the size I want it to be, but to the size that the fabric kind of wants to be. I use purl bumps to remind myself what size needles I used. And I use the US sizes. I don't always remember the metric sizes, but I'll do my best. And again, let that dry overnight. So you can see this is my finished this is my finished swatch. See if I can get it. There we go. And I was actually surprised. This was on US 5s. Yeah, I went from 5s to 4s to 2.5s, and it was still a bit more open than I would want. I could feel, I was thinking about a hat when I was doing this, and this is just a little bit too loose for a hat. I was surprised how far I had to knit down. So this told me something, that even though I was spinning a lot thicker than I'm used to, it was still a little bit thinner than I would like. So I went back to the wheel and I made another little baby sample, little baby skein. This is even smaller. This is about 1/4 of an ounce. And I made a second sample card. Because when you're sampling, sometimes you get a sample that's almost what you want. And sometimes you can get away with that. You can say, okay, I just need to spin a little bit thicker than this. And then you use your sample card as kind of a, okay, don't go thinner than this. I've done that before. It can work, but it's a little bit less stressful if you do a little bit more sampling and then you know exactly what you want. I'm not even knitting a swatch from this one. I just know that as I look at this second sample card, that's going to be the yarn that I want. Before I knit it up, I'll have to knit another swatch. But here you can see the 2 yarns next to each other. I don't know if you can even tell, but this one is just a little bit thinner. And with the same ply settings, I can see that this is just a little bit less plied than I want. And this has that perfect plumpness that I like to see in my 2-ply. So that takes us through the basic sampling process. I'm interested to hear how your process is the same or different. When I went through the 51 yarns, knit along and spin along, I went through this process over 51 times, and it was always really interesting because you always find out something surprising, even if it's that, hey, I spin this very consistently and this is exactly what I expected. That can be really encouraging to learn, but I find I almost always learn something surprising, like, hey, I'm getting the stitches princh that I want for DK that I would expect on size 2.5 US needles, because hand spun acts differently, and it's often surprising. If you have any questions or comments, please do drop them in the comments for this video or in the Premiere live chat, or send them to me on Slack or by email. I would love to have a conversation about this topic with you. And we're going to dive back in a couple weeks and talk a little bit more about measurements and when to take them and what to do with them. Thank you so much for joining me on this new journey. I'm really excited to share this stuff with you, and this community means so much to me. So I'm glad to be coming alongside you in your spinning journeys, and that we can learn together. Have an awesome day and happy spinning. Bye-bye.